Today we're going to talk about Curley's wife, who is really interesting because she's the only woman on the ranch. And originally you see her as a stereotype of a woman who is seductive and dangerous and will lead innocent men astray. But actually, if you stick with it, Steinbeck reveals her character as a disappointed, lonely young woman whose dreams have already been shattered twice before the novel even starts. At the beginning, she's seen as being like bait in a trap that men will just stray into. And it feeds very much into a narrative where men are helpless victims to their sexual urges. So Curley's wife is deliberately flirtatious. She's symbolically linked with prostitution. She's associated with Eve, the woman in the beginning of the Bible story who is linked with the downfall of Adam and his eviction from the Garden of Eden. And it's also interesting that she is prefigured by the girl in weed, who lied and made an accusation of rape against Lenny, which was untrue and resulted in him and George being pursued by a lynch mob. So the fact that there are obvious parallels between these two women suggests that Steinbeck's saying that they have something in common, that she might also tell similar lies. I said that she's linked symbolically with prostitution, and when you look at Steinbeck's first description of her, the makeup and the repeated use of the colour red and the fact that her shoes have little bouquets of ostrich feathers, they're symbolic of luxury, but also of something slightly predatory about her. So you've got the colour red with its connotations of danger and lust, and she's linked in some ways through this description with prostitution. And when she smiles and twists her body, she's obviously trying to show herself off, and she throws her body forwards and she wants the men to look at her. And when she says nobody can't blame a person for looking, she's ostensibly talking about herself looking for Curley, but she's obviously got this second meaning that nobody can be blamed for looking at her. It's not their fault if they look at her. And George's reaction to her, Jesus, what a tramp. Bet she'd clear out for $20. It's really interesting that George believes that she would leave the ranch for as little as $20. Again, it links her with prostitution, that she would go with a man for money. And he describes her as a rat trap again. And again, you've got this idea that bait is laid for men to take, and that when they take it, they will suffer. Wit, well, ain't she a Lulu? Doesn't need a lot of interpretation. And when George carefully says that he hasn't seen much of her, Wit takes that and puts a slight twist on it. You'll see plenty, she ain't concealing nothing, suggesting that she's not particularly modest in the way she behaves around the men. George then repeats that she's a jailbait all set on the trigger. And it's interesting that along with this connotation of men being helpless victims lured into her trap, there's also perhaps the suggestion that as bait, she is also perhaps not necessarily making a conscious decision. The cheese in a trap doesn't sort of deliberately plan to be there. Candy tells her in Crooks's room on the Saturday night when all the men have gone into Soledad, you got no call fooling around with other guys causing trouble. And immediately he blames her for being there and for trying to have conversations. We learn that night when she's in Crooks's room that she's a disappointed actress, and the 1930s were very much the golden age of Hollywood. Much of the film output of the 30s was black and white, but the big new technological advance was talkies, the fact that these were the first movies that weren't silent. But by 1933, probably you're starting to get decreased attendance at films as the Depression was felt. There are some big names in Hollywood in the 1930s, Jean Harlow, Greta Garbo, John Wayne, Clark Gable, Shirley Temple, and some of the characters that you're starting to see, Popeye, Tarzan, Donald Duck makes his first appearance in the 1930s, and so does King Kong. So if we have a quick look at some of the quotations, I tell you I could have went with shows, hate her grammar, but you know what she means, and a guy told me he could put me in pictures. I could have made something of myself. It's really interesting that she believes this, And I think it's the first sign of something that we can sympathise, that she's so naive. These lines from men who want to take her to Hollywood are just chat-up lines. You know, she would have just been a sexual object in Hollywood, and she believes that she would have been an actress. I never got that letter, she said. I always thought my old lady stole it. When she's talking to Lenny at this point, just before he kills her. But even at that point where she's talking about it for the second time, she blames her mother rather than seeing that the men were lying to her. I could have sat in them big hotels and had pictures took of me. Her view of what Hollywood had to offer her is very superficial. She looks at the glamour, she looks at the rewards, not at the hard work. And then we come to the fact that the men regard her as a bitch. She is pretty much universally disliked. The only man who doesn't show overt dislike for her is Slim, and he calls her good-looking, and he takes the time to be kind to her. Although this backfires on him because Slim is the one that Curley suspects of paying her inappropriate attention. Just before Curley has the fight with Lenny, we get this conversation where Slim says, "You've been asking too often," you know, because Curley gets very suspicious of the fact that Slim has the time of day for her. We learn that she married Curley when she realised that she wasn't going to Hollywood. And this is something that isn't particularly admirable because her motives for marrying Curley are purely selfish. She wasn't going to get to Hollywood, so she married Curley. She looked for the next source of financial security. She didn't love him, but she married him. The next thing we see that fits with this description of her being a bit of a bitch, that she has it in her to be cruel and not to think of the welfare of others, when she says to Lenny that if all he wants out of life is rabbits, I might get a couple of rabbits myself. And the fact that she's prepared to deliberately entice Lenny away from George shows selfishness and the fact that she doesn't understand the consequences of what she's doing. Then she turns on the three of them. She's already said they left all the weak ones behind. She has no qualms about being rude to these men and really being quite insulting when she calls them a bunch of bindlestiffs, a nigger and a dum-dum and a lousy old sheep. She picks on something about each one of them. Crooks's colour, Lenny's intellect, Candy's white hair, and she turns it into insults and she puts them down and she's unpleasant. And when Crooks tells her to go home, that she's not welcome in his room, she plays the race card, she plays the gender card. She's absolutely vicious. I could get you strung up on a tree so easy it ain't even funny. She reminds him straight away that a white woman's word is worth more than a black man's life, and that she could get him lynched with an accusation. And that's where I say that she's prefigured by the woman in Weed, because that's exactly what she would have to do. That accusation of rape that the girl in Weed cried on Lenny is exactly what she would have to do to Crooks, and she's willing to do it. When Candy tells her that he would tell if she tried to frame Crooks, her reply, "Tell and be damned." I don't know whether this is her cleverness, but it's so reminiscent of the line, "Publish and be damned." And that comes from the Duke of Wellington in 1824 when he was blackmailed by a former lover, and she told him that he could pay to stay out of her memoirs effectively, and his reply was, "Publish and be damned." So she did. And Curley's Wife says, "Tell and be damned." I don't know if she knows that she's echoing it, but Steinbeck did. Curley's Wife isn't happy though. Despite all the meanness, she's newly married. She's been married 2 weeks to a man she doesn't like. She is so unimportant on the ranch that she is never even given the dignity of her own name. She's defined as Curley's possession. She is just a chattel. So when the other men talk about the fact that she's married 2 weeks and got the eye, she's looking for attention wherever she can find it, because she's not getting it from Curley. Curley has really no time for her, and although I criticised her earlier for having married him without love, I think he's just as guilty of that. I don't think he loves her at all. She's just a trophy wife, a possession. Part of the reason I think that is this awful thing about the glove full of Vaseline that Curley tells around. And George and Candy immediately respond to the fact. Curley says he's keeping that hand soft for his wife. George's response, that's a dirty thing to tell around. And I don't actually think it's Candy that George is criticising, I think it's Curley. Because telling everybody that he's wearing a glove full of Vaseline to keep his hand soft for his wife is making her sexual satisfaction the business of every other man on the ranch. Curley almost invites all the other men to speculate about her sex life. And I think that is dirty. He humiliates her by sharing that information far more than he humiliates himself. After his hand is crushed, you can feel that she's a little bit more at liberty. That's when she appears in Crooks's room on the Saturday evening, and then she's in the barn with Lenny on the Sunday afternoon. And she now feels free to talk about the fact that she isn't happy. Sure, I got a husband, swell guy, ain't he? She invites the other men to criticise him, to share her opinion that Curley isn't a nice man. And she hates the life that she's signed herself up to, hanging around in the boss's house, keeping house presumably for the pair of them because there's no mention of Curley's mother. Don't know what's happened to her, but we assume she's probably dead. Think I like to stick around in that house all the time? She becomes effectively just a glorified servant, hanging about keeping house for the boss and for Curley. After she dies, I think is the point probably where we see the greatest pity for her. And it doesn't come from the other characters. Curley shows no grief, just the desire to get revenge, and when he says, I'm going to get him, I'm going for my shotgun, I'll kill the big son of a bitch myself, I'll shoot him in the guts. Curley's first concern isn't that he's lost a wife he loved. Curley's first concern is to inflict the most prolonged and painful death on Lenny that he possibly can, and I think we can see that that's as much revenge for the damage to his hand as it is revenge for the loss of his wife. Candy is left in the barn with her after they all go off after Lenny, and Candy's words to her, everybody knowed you'd mess things up. Candy blames her. He doesn't blame Lenny, and I find this quite hard to take. She has been murdered, she is the victim here, and Candy still blames her. Steinbeck, by contrast, is a wee bit kinder, and he talks about the fact that as she lies in the hay, the meanness and the plannings and the discontent and the ache for attention were all gone from her face. And I think we see that he does acknowledge that she was mean and she was a bit scheming and devious and unhappy and desperate for attention, but he then goes on to say that without all that, she's very pretty and simple and her face is sweet and young. And that's where we see that Steinbeck brings closure to her life by acknowledging her youth, her beauty, and the positives that we've otherwise missed throughout the novel.